This video is going to help you to revise how to identify different types of slopes and various features on a topographic map. And it's important in order to identify the various features and slopes to know your various contour patterns. So the patterns are really how those contour lines are displayed, and that then gives us an indication of what we're actually looking at. So in order to see gentle and steep slopes, I've color-coded all the different slopes here, but in order to see that gentle slope, you can see here that the contour lines are actually far apart, indicating that that region, that entire slope over going perpendicular over the actual contours is a gentle region. Okay, then the steep slope is this region here where the contour lines are really close together. If we want to see a concave versus convex, for concave, we know that we are going from gentle first in lower land to steep at the higher ground. So identify first what is your low land and what is your high ground. And we can do that obviously using altitude evidence. So here I have the contour that is orientated this way towards the upslope, sitting at 1,480 meters. And right at the top of this Loskop hill is a spot height showing that it is 1,586 meters. So this is obviously the lower ground and this is the higher ground. And the lower ground is going to be gentle first. So those contour lines start off being quite far apart and then they become much closer as you get closer to the top. And that would create a concaved slope. And if we look at that in cross-section form, it goes gentle and then steep to the top. So that's concaved, it's caved. Let's just get that shape again, caved in. If we look at the opposite, which is convex, which is more like a heel shape, it starts off actually steeper at the bottom and then becomes more gentle as it works towards the top. So that example here is where at the base here, the contours were kind of close together, showing more of a steeper slope. And then as they get to the top here, closer towards the watershed line, you're going to have further apart contours showing more of a gentle slope towards the top, and that makes more of a convex shape. Then a gorge and watershed is shown on the next page. We'll look at those now, and then you've got your difference between a saddle, a pass, and a puert. And I've shown this in this example here in a theoretical kind of drawing. When we look at a pass and a saddle, those two are very similar. They look the same, okay, in terms of the two patterns in contours. You're going to have two high-lying regions on either side, okay, and then you have a lower-lying dip between the two. And that dip of land between the two is going to either be accessible, okay, at an altitude that is accessible to the surrounding region, and that then makes it a pass, so you can pass it because it's accessible. Or if it's really high up in terms of the altitude and not really accessible at all unless you were going on a hike, then that really becomes a saddle, and that is not accessible. We can see that both of them have V-shaped contours pointing towards each other, showing the region that is the pass or the actual saddle. And those V-shapes are not going to be a very strong cut V-shape. You can just see that they kind of make an open U shape towards pointing where that region of the saddle or the pass is found. But the one is accessible because it's found, the entire landscape is found at a lower altitude in that region, whereas the saddle is going to be found much higher up and not accessible. And then what happens is that if a river cuts down that landscape and erodes away the land that is kind of the lower lying land between those two high lying regions, and it cuts it down all the way to be the same altitude as the surrounding area. So now we're going to get the same altitude here all around, okay? That is then a puert or a gap that has been cut through that ridge. So this used to be one whole ridge, and the river cut through it and created these two isolated high-lying areas with then a kind of pathway between that gap between the ridge. And there's no V-shaped contours really showing and outlining that region of land like in a saddle and a pass. And what's important is that you've got very similar, a similar height of the actual Poort or the Gap with the surrounding land that is around it on the outside of that ridge. Okay, it's all kind of in the same level of the valley floor. Whereas here, you're going to find the surrounding land still continues to decrease below the actual feature of the pass or the neck. So we have an example of a saddle here. It's a nice example up here. You can see those V-shaped contours pointing to each other, the high-lying land on either side, and that kind of low-lying dip between the two. Not really accessible to people at quite a high altitude, and so it's a saddle. Then we can see an example of a Poort. There's no pass in this example, but a Poort, and this is where we have that high-lying land on either side, and then the river has really cut through it, and you can find that the land is at the same altitude as the surrounding valley floor here. So that's all kind of at the same altitude, and it makes it that you can actually pass through that gap, okay, making that a Poort or a gap. Identifying a valley or a spur, something we've done from very junior grades. When we have a look at a valley, generally you will see a river flowing down through it. Have a look at where your altitude is, the high-lying land versus the low-lying land, and then you will see that your V-shaped contours are actually pointing to higher altitude, indicating that that whole strip there is the valley. On the reverse side, we've got the land sticking out that hasn't been eroded by a river, and it's making V-shaped contours pointing to the lower land now. There's the lower land and there's the higher land, and that's then the spur of land that is obviously on either side over here of the actual valley that's been carved away. So there's a valley where all those little rivers are flowing down, of valleys being carved away by the actual river action with spurs in between. And then if we want to identify cliffs and waterfalls, that's on your fluvial interpretation summary. And remember, the cliff is when those contours are really basically on top of each other, showing a vertical drop. And the waterfall, there is a symbol for that waterfall. And often the name of the waterfall is written there, waterfall, Grabis or whatever. Okay, let's have a look at some of the other examples. We've got, I said, the gorge, when you have a very steep, deep, narrow valley, and you can see that this gorge has been carved out by this rejuvenated river. So the river has cut down into the landscape and made a very deep, steep valley. How do I see that? Because there's many contour lines showing that there's a big drop in altitude, so it's deep. It's steep because all the contour lines are very close to each other. And it's very narrow because I can see the distance between the one side of the gorge and the other is a very narrow distance. We don't have a huge floodplain here, so there's a big drop going down in a very narrow region, and that's the gorge. Then a great example here of your Poort or gap. Here you can see your high-lying mountain on either side, and you can actually see that a route or transport route road has actually been developed through the gap in the mountain there. So this then is the Poort or the gap, and you can see that it is eroded all the way down to be at the same altitude as the surrounding land over here and the surrounding land over there. So there's your Poort or your gap, and often they label them as well with a name. So here you've got the name of the Poort. Then in order to identify a watershed, I told you look for your fingertip streams, okay? And once you've found those fingertip streams, they all point towards where the dividing high-lying land would separate them from each other. So all these tributaries are flowing, just drawing a generalized pattern, but in those stream water ones or fingertip streams are all flowing in a northwesterly direction. Okay, all of those are going northwest, and all of these are flowing to the southeast. And we can see that that high-lying land that separates the two is really where that watershed line would be found. So that's how you would highlight it and draw it on. And remember that that then indicates the sort of ridge line that says this is the high-lying land separating the tributaries flowing from the one side and the other. Okay, and that is a revision of all your different types of slopes.